Do your temples suck? Do you want to know how to make them not suck? Well, in this video, we're going to be going through classical temples and how you can make them in Minecraft, with the individual components, layers, and details following on from my previous tutorials. We're also going to be looking at some of the differences between Greek temples and Roman temples, and the individual little pieces that make them different, as well as ways that you can make authentic Greek and Roman temples in your Minecraft worlds. Now, the first thing we're going to have a look at is the actual planning and the proportions of your Greek and Roman temples, and how you're going to get the proportions of your temple right so it looks right in your build. So these little two diagrams here, I've got the light blue, which represents a Greek temple, and I've got the red wall over here, which represents a Roman temple. And as you can see, despite being the same width in columns, they're both hexastyle temples, so they are 6 columns wide. They are different in terms of their depth, but they're also different in terms of the actual internal layout as well. Now, the basic formula that they used in ancient Greece was multiplying the front columns, so 6 in this instance, by 2 and then adding 1. So as you can see here, if you count them, you have 13 columns going back here, and then 6 wide. So the Romans did something different. They multiplied it by 2, so the front columns by 2, and then they minused 1, they subtracted 1 from that total. So in this instance, we've got 11 columns and 6 columns wide. So there's difference, it's 13 and 6, and then it's 11 and 6 here. So basically the difference is that Greek temples have a more elongated profile, as you can see here, and the Roman temples are a bit stubbier, but they're still kind of rectangular. Now what you also would have seen is a difference in terms of the internal layouts and how they were arranged. So typically in a Greek temple you would have had a back room over here, and you would have had the main sanctuary of the god, or the statue of the god, in here, with then some columns running in there. The Roman temple was different. A Roman temple had one main, what you would call the cellar, and it would have indented in. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the end of the video, but there's this slight distinction in terms of how a Roman temple and how a Greek temple are divided, in that you've got one entrance in the back and one entrance in the front in a Greek temple, and then you've got one entrance in the front, typically in a Roman temple. Now, the second major base point that you're going to want to learn about and want to know about when building a Roman and a Greek temple are the actual base components of both of these. Now, these do vary between the two different styles, but it mostly varies at the bottom over here. So at the bottom here, this is an example of a Greek temple, and I'll tell you why this would be a Greek temple in this example, despite it being made out of wool. The difference is that at the bottom of a Greek temple, you had something called a stylobate. Now, this red here represents a stylobate, and that was a kind of flat stepped platform that went all the way around the building, and it raised the building off the top of the floor. Now, in a Roman temple, this was slightly different. You would have had something called a podium, which was taller, and it had a single staircase running up the middle. Now, I'm going to show this a bit later in the video on the difference between the two, but just know that you have some sort of base. Now, in the blue here, from the light blue, the cyan, and the dark blue, you would have had your columns. And these are split up into 3 different sections. You've got the base of your column, so you would have had some sort of ringed base here. Then you've got the main shaft of the column, so that's the fluted column shaft. And then you would have had the capital of the column. Now, this is some sort of representation of an ionic column. There are many different types of columns in classical architecture, but this is kind of a basic one that you would have seen in many Athenian architecture and many classical Greek architecture. Then in the pink and the purple over here, we have what is represented as the entablature. Now, this was split into 2 different sections. That was typically the architrave, or multiple different sections, the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. And then up here you have the pediment with then different statues and whatever, so like the acroterion at the top. So in the green, this is your pediment area. Now, what a mistake that people often make is that they ignore this area in the middle here, the entablature. And this is one of the most important symbolic parts of a classical temple in terms of the actual storytelling and the sculpture that was on the side of the temple. So that's got to split your columns over here. Same in terms of your podium. You need to build a podium or stylobate to basically raise it off the ground. And that helps you basically designate that this is a temple and it's not part of the floor. So here we have an example of what would be an ancient Greek hexastyle temple over here. Now, how can we tell this is ancient Greek? Well, there's a couple of little telltale signs that you can tell it's ancient Greek. First of all, you've got these little things up here that I'm going to explain later in the video, but the main telltale sign is that you've got the stylobate over here rather than the podium. And then there's a difference in the proportions. So as you can see, this is a 6 wide and it's 13 long in the back there. So the proportions are slightly different. But much of it is the same, and much of the components and the composition are the same, because Roman temples are basically just a adapted form of Greek temples in the future. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down. So as you can see in the red here, we've got the stylobate. In the light blue over here, we've got the base of the column. Now this is in 2 blocks high and it's in a different color. It's kind of a decorative purpose over there. Now this part of the column is the shaft, running up to then the capital over here. So I'm imagining this as the capital, and this would be some sort of Ionic capital over here. Then we've got the entablature, so we've got the frieze up here, and this is going to be the frieze, and then you've got the architrave that is underneath here. Now, this is kind of more like a double frieze that's two blocks tall, and the architrave is kind of hard to display in smaller temples like this. But as you get bigger, then you can portray a larger architrave, which I'm going to show later on in the video. Then you have your cornice, so you've got your cornice is going on the bottom of all of this here, and this is like your little details and these plates that kind of mimic vernacular Greek timber architecture. So what you might not know about ancient Greek temples is that they, alike to ancient Egyptian temples, the stone structures actually mimic the timber structures that were originally built by the ancient Greeks, like this over here, which is a kind of timber archaic ancient Greek temple. Now, in the green area over here, we have the pediment, which includes the acroterion. So this is kind of the whole pediment area, with then you've got your pediment relief over here. And as you can see, it gets bigger over here and whatever in a octastyle, so an 8-wide column. Now, the thing that's useful to know about ancient Greek and ancient Roman temples is that there was a defined perfect angle of the pediment itself and of the roof angle, which was roughly 22 degrees or 22.5 degrees. It really depends on who you reference. But if you look at like Vitruvius's On Architecture book, which is kind of one of the most famous examples of classical architecture as like a journal or a manual of classical architecture, Vitruvius talks about some of these ideas in his book On Architecture. And as you can see here, this is a Roman example, so it's slightly different to the Greek example, but as you can see, you've got the podium at the bottom, which has the staircase and it's much taller. So we've got the podium represented here in red, we've got the columns with the capitals and the base in the blue, we've got then the entablature with the different details of it. So here we've got some dentils at the bottom of it, which are kind of like these sticky down bits, represented in pink, and then we have the pediment up the top with the kind of statues on top of the roof. Now we're going to talk about some columns. Now there are more than 3 classical column types. However, I'm going to go into the main 3, or the primary 3 column types that were present in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So primarily in ancient Greece, what you would have found until the Hellenistic period and much later in ancient Greece, more so in the classical Greek period, is you would have had the Doric column. So the Doric column is the kind of bog standard, and I'm going to show it on screen now, the bog standard fluted column, or even just round column in many cases, which was non-decorative and had a non-decorative capital at the top. Now in Minecraft, what I'm doing is I'm representing this with some signs, and then I've got some shelves at the bottom which basically make up the base. You can make this bigger as well if you do it too wide, so you make a fatter column like this for a bigger temple, and then you can add some slabs at the top to really emphasize that ledge on the top. Now the second type is a Ionic column, and these were pretty common in Athens and in the Attica area and much of the kind of Athenian Empire. But then it kind of spread to the rest of the ancient Greek world, and they were a much more decorative column than the Doric column. And as you can see, how I'm trying to replicate this in Minecraft is I've got some shelves, so I've got some pallet shelves. I've then got the fluted column here, so I've got the fluted quartz pillar. I'm then putting some signs around the bottom. I'm taking just some polished diorite blocks with some upside down stairs. And if you make it 1 wide, it looks really, really good like this. And it kind of works as a Ionic column. Now what you might typically want to do, if you're going to put like an entablature on top, it might be easy to make your entablature out of shelves, so it insets. Or what you could do is you could add a slab and then you can extend it on top like so. Now this next column over here, this is another bigger Ionic column. So this is then being used with the just full blocks with some buttons, 2 wide, some shelves. It's pretty simple, kind of an easy design to do, but it still emphasizes those scrolls that come at the end of the Ionic column. And these scrolls represented knowledge, and they were basically kind of shows of how smart people were, or how smart the architects were, and how smart the structure was meant to be for the god that the temple was representing. Now moving on to my favourite column, which is the Corinthian column. And the Corinthian column was a more later developed composite idea of a column where it was more ornate and had many different ideas into it. But the main idea is that it's a mix of flower and like leaf petals with different scrolls and all these sorts of things. So what I'm doing here in the one wide column, the kind of skinnier column, is I've got some pale oak shelves at the bottom. I've then got the fluted column with the quartz pillar. I've got a sign, I've got a tripwire hook, I've got another shelf, and then I've got an upside down polished diorite stair. And I'm basically doing the exact same thing for this one over here. And I think it actually looks better when it's one wide like this and it's a bit, less convincing like this. But you could try other different things. I think sometimes the fence gates work quite well. So like the pale oak fence gates rather than the shelves on these, because the shelves kind of look a little bit too small. But yeah, this is kind of the idea that I typically use for a Corinthian column in my massive Roman temples and ancient Greek temples. Now looking at the entablatures themselves. I've got 4 different examples of entablatures that are varying in detail and kind of varying in their styles. And the thing is, what I quite like to do is I quite like to have a mix of signs, buttons, and then something else. So what I've got over here is I've got signs, buttons, and I've got some shelves. Got some signs, buttons, and I've got some flipped in fence gates. Then I've got some ladders in this one over here, and I've kind of flipped it over in this one. But then this being a completely different idea, where it's a kind of Roman entablature for a hexastyle temple that I built in an earlier video way back in the summer. And you can kind of see you've got some dentils here, you've got some buttons, and then you've got the architrave at the bottom over here. But as you kind of get the idea, it goes in layers. So a big important thing about classical architecture is the repetition and proportions and the actual bands of layers. It's kind of like a layered cake, where you have different rules for different layers and it goes up in layers as you go up. And if you miss a layer, it doesn't quite work. Or if your layer doesn't quite have the right amount of detail, or if your layer is not proportioned correctly, which is kind of a hard thing to do, it doesn't quite work in many ways if you want to kind of replicate an actual classical building in many senses. So these are just some ideas of what things that you could do for your entablature areas on your build. So the interior of Greek and Roman temples does vary quite a lot, but it's kind of more fixed in the Greek temples, and it varies a little bit more depending on what area of the empire that you were in and the type of temple that you were building. So typically what a Greek temple would have looked like in the center, and I've kind of made a base layout in terms of like just a diagram in red wall over here, where you've got the columns that come inwards that help support the roof. Then you have a back wall, you might have some doors into this back chamber over here, and then you've got a door out to the back over here. Now typically what you would have found is that this would have been the hall where the main statue of the cult god would have been found, and then back here would have been some sort of treasury space or book storage space sort of thing, which would have had offerings to the god, scriptures to the god, etc. So we got an example here that's taken from this temple over here, which this is kind of an adaptation of something that I've used in previous builds before, where you basically have this idea of these columns that run along over here, and then you have this kind of capital at the top here, and then you have these details that run across that basically, bound the top of the columns over there. You kind of get the idea, and then you have the statue in the middle. Now, as you come to the back, what you might be using over here is you might be using some sort of bookshelf area or storage area for offerings to the god, like gold or food. And then you would have had a big statue of the god in the middle. So that, in this example here, we've got a big example of a god sat down on a chair. You would have also had some windows at the top over here. So depending on the size of the temple, you would have had some windows. So this, as an octa-style temple, it's quite big. You might have had some windows made out of wood, with just some wood paneling along the top over here. Now, in terms of Roman temples, things would have been a little bit different, as you don't have that split in the actual programming of the building, and you don't have the kind of separation between the two rooms. So what you would have had, and this is from one of our previous builds, I'm going to link this in the video of our Roman temple that I built a few months ago. This has engaged columns on the inside, and then it has a statue of the god towards the back, with then these indents over here. So this is kind of the plan that we've got of this temple in red. And as you can see, it's one single room, and you would have had this sort of indent towards the back where you would have had a god, the statue of the god, and then you would have had engaged columns in the walls, depending on the size of the temple. However, in a bigger temple, such as this one over here, so I've just done this little diagram over here to represent a bigger temple. the columns would not have likely been engaged into the walls. They would have been moved outwards because you've now got the need for columns to sit in the middle to support the structure ahead. So you have a door here, you have your columns, alike to the Greek temple over there. The columns are coming inwards, however they go all the way to the back, and then you kind of have this semicircle-like shape in here where then you would have had the statue of the god in this space over here, as you can see. And that kind of gives you the basis for what your Roman temple interior would have looked like. But then what you would have done in the inside is that you would have had a mix of different floor materials. You would have then had statues in the walls. You would have then had columns with capitals at the top. And then you would have had ornate ceiling decoration with then different plant pots and all that sort of stuff on the inside. Now, classical temples were made of many different styles of temples in terms of the actual size of them and the columns at the front. So the main three types that you would have seen in the Greek and Roman world were tetrastyles, so 4 columns wide, hexastyles, 6 columns wide, and this was the most common in the Roman Empire and the Greek world, and then you would have had an octastyle. So for example, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was an octastyle temple, despite a massive octastyle temple, and the Parthenon of Athens was another octastyle temple, for an example. And these were the most common types of temples that were built because they were oftentimes, even the octastyle temples were big. They were big projects to do, but they weren't such massive imperial projects as the larger temples that were bigger than 8 columns wide that you would have seen in the Roman Empire. So what we've got here is you've got tetrastyle, which is an archaic tetrastyle temple, which is made of timber, which is kind of what it would have originated from. You've got hexastyle, made of stone, and then you've got an octastyle. It would have been the same with the Roman Empire. So here we have an example of a tetrastyle Roman temple over here. Then we have an octastyle Roman temple over here, a hexastyle, sorry, Roman temple over here. I don't have an example of an octastyle in this video, but they built even bigger ones. They built a decastyle temple, so you have examples of the Temple of Apollo, which I forget where that is in the Mediterranean, but there was very, very big temple, like the Temple of Venus at Rome was a decastyle temple. And then there is a kind of skeptical dodecastyle 12-column temple that is supposedly have existed in the Roman Empire, which is a 12-column wide project. So to finish off this video, I'm going to walk you through a quick example that I've done here of an octastyle temple. So I've added a couple of extra details from the example I've shown before, and I've changed a couple of things just to make it a little more historically accurate to an ancient Greek temple. So one of the main things you're going to want to look at is your pediment sculpture over here. So what you can see in the middle over here is I've got a mix of different colours. What I like to quite use is I like to quite use some of the more earthy tones. So rather than having like the really bright colours, you have the different wood colours, you have the different stone colours, etc. Then what I quite like to do in the entablature area, so this is actually kind of a temple of the Ionic order. It varies in some parts, but it's mostly the Ionic order that you see bits in between here with the sculpture, with then these, what you would kind of call the butt elements of the entablature, with then this long architrave that runs all the way along the bottom. And I've done this in actually white stained glass paint. So this actually looks quite good on top of the larger columns like this, with your volutes, the kind of scrolls at the end of your Ionic columns. And then as you can see, you just got the bases over here, and I've used a pretty muted color palette, but it's still quite a very colorful temple. You're not going to see many ancient Greek and ancient Roman temples that are just a single color. They would have had many different colors here. So if we just have a look around the temple, I've added some other little details. So on the edges of the roof, you're going to want to have some little flicky up bits, as I'm going to call them there. There's a proper technical term for this, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. Then you've got some extra details on the roofline with the acroterions, and then the statues on the corners and the top of the pediment area. And there you go, that's the main example that kind of puts together a lot of things that we've talked about in this video today. And there you have it, guys. That was the first part looking into our guide of classical temples in Minecraft. Next month in the second part, I'll be showcasing how to plan your cities and towns around temples, and how the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans planned their towns and planned their temples in terms of orientation to the sun, east and west, and in relation to other buildings. So stay tuned for that video. But I want to say a big thanks to everyone who's watched the video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video. We've started to build a really nice community around these sorts of ideas and our conversations about ancient architecture in Minecraft and how we can build it. So I really appreciate you guys for tuning in and watching the videos every week. And until the next one, guys, have a good weekend and goodbye.